Okay, if everybody pretty much has their munchies, I think we'll get underway. I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists, and then I'm going to pose one then and now question to each of them. The topic of this panel is Barack Obama then, President Obama now, what went wrong, what went right, and where does he stand today? On my immediate left is Perry Bacon. He's a reporter with the Washington Post. He focuses on national politics and policy. He has a column that's called In Session, and he contributes to The Root, which is an online magazine that focuses on African American issues. To his left is Christina Bellantoni, associate politics editor with Roll Call. She's also a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School for Government. On her left is Carl Cannon, the Washington editor of Real Clear Politics, which is the go-to site for anybody who is interested in unbiased polling. He is past president of the White House Correspondents Association, and he covered the White House for both the Baltimore Sun and the National Journal. On his left is Norm Ornstein, political commentator and author. He has a weekly column in Roll Call, and he's an election analyst for CBS, and he's a resident analyst at the American Enterprise Institute. And last on the panel on the left is Leslie Sanchez. She's a political analyst currently serving on the board of directors for Resurgent Republic, which I believe is an advocacy group. She was a deputy press secretary for the Republican National Committee, and she headed the White House Initiative on Education Excellence for Hispanic Americans, I think during the second Bush administration? First Bush administration, okay. All right, as I said, the topic here is then and now. President Obama was elected with 53% of the vote, and was the most resounding mandate in terms of popular vote that a president had gotten in some time, with the slogan, "Yes, we can." And I still remember Inauguration Day when 1.8 million people came into the district, and it was really a high moment where I think people thought that he was going to be able to carry through on all his campaign commitments and really change life as we know it here in Washington. And here we are now quite 3 years later. We have 9.1% unemployment, and we're mired in a political quagmire. Victory in 2012, if it's possible, I think the president has said himself, quote, "we'll have to grind it out." And I think President Obama has set his own chances, or put it better than anybody, when he said his chances for re-election are better than they were for being elected in the first place with the name Barack Hussein Obama. So I want to pose a question to each of the panelists, and I want to begin with Perry. He has traveled with the candidate in 2008 and traveled with the president now. He has some feel for the enthusiasm that was there, and maybe the enthusiasm that's building or not, and also the key states and the key groups that this president is going to need if he's going to put together a winning coalition. So give us some firsthand impressions, Perry.
I mean, I guess the first thought is the electoral map is pretty similar to what it was last time, but I think that the emphasis will be different. I guess Indiana is the one exception. Obama was the first Democrat since, I think, 1964 to win Indiana, and his campaign has kind of already written off Indiana this time, which is a little sad for me. I'm from Louisville, Kentucky, so it was nice to get closer back, but I don't think I'm going to be making that many trips there this time. The emphasis will be different because the White House team, their general view is that the independent, Obama won overwhelmingly among independents last time, and their view is the Republicans will probably win independents this time, and that changes the map in some ways. It means that they'll probably spend more, as a percentage of their money, they spend a lot in Ohio, Wisconsin, the Midwest particularly, and they'll spend more money this time in states like Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Virginia, North Carolina, and Florida, because their emphasis is going to be on the demographics this time. States that have large populations of African Americans, Hispanics, and people and kind of transplant people with lots of college degrees who might live in like the Research Triangle in North Carolina. So the big emphasis will be on those kinds of states, a little more and a little less than the upper Midwest section that he did very well in last time. So that'll be a big change in terms of their time, I think, this time.
Can I ask you about Ohio specifically and the results that we had, I guess, 10 days ago?
Right.
And whether that puts that state more in flux than maybe we would have thought before the referendum?
I think that state was always going to be in flux, but I think I would have probably said it was more likely to go for a Mitt Romney before. And I think it does suggest that Kasich, the governor's there, his agenda is not very popular. Obama's not popular nationally. The Republicans in Ohio aren't popular locally. And I think therefore, and it shows you this is going to be a very tight state again.
Okay. Christina, you're at the Kennedy School, so I figure you're an expert on policy. This president was elected on really a promise to create jobs, but also a promise to reform health care, and it was his first really major initiative. It was a messy road to get there, and now the Affordable Care Act is going to be before the Supreme Court. Can you just assess where health care fits into this president's agenda and also his election chances?
Hi, thanks for having me. So this is really an area where both sides feel like they have the upper hand. President Obama, his team feels confident that the Supreme Court will say his health care law was constitutional. Republicans are confident that it will not be ruled constitutional, and that's where I think you're going to see a lot of the battle played out, when this actually is before voters in the form of a referendum on President Obama. But one thing that you hear a lot from both Democrats and Republicans is they feel like President Obama lost so much of his political capital by spending so much time on health care. And the White House and the campaign's view, and a lot of the sort of people that helped shape the policy behind the scenes really say that this was the only way big change would ever be possible, is if they spent all of this time and put together this healthcare law in the more than a year that it took to get it passed when they had both houses of Congress. So fast forward to right now, the Obama campaign is also, as you all know, very focused on Mitt Romney. They think he's going to end up being the nominee. They feel that because of what he did with healthcare in Massachusetts, that actually helps them not fight out the election on healthcare, regardless of what happens with the Supreme Court. And they also want to be able to say, we have turned our attention to jobs and the economy. We did spend a lot of time on this, but it was worth it. And they also like to say that every single Republican that is running for president, including Romney, would roll back the good things about health care, which they've made pretty clear that they are going to campaign on the fact that children can stay on their parents' insurance after they leave college, which is something that they're going to be able to mobilize the youth vote in that direction. This is what they believe. And then also the pre-existing conditions issue, not to mention the fact that a lot of the sort of good things about healthcare are going to be put into place in another year. So that's sort of where the White House and the campaign are coming from, but the Republicans really feel like it remains unpopular. The country didn't like seeing this long and messy fight that you referenced. And also, they feel like the country really believes that President Obama took his eye off the ball when it came to the economy. So that's what they're going to do. That's one of the reasons you're still seeing that health care vote come up in ads from both the Senate and House Republican campaigns that are trying to win control of Congress, for both the Senate and House. So this is going to continually be a major theme.
Maybe it says something more about me than Mitt Romney, but I can't believe in his heart of hearts he really would want to overturn this law, because it really is modeled after what he did in Massachusetts. And I also think the implementation is proceeding, and it's going to be very difficult to take away benefits that people have gotten and to dismantle this. What is your view on that?
Sure. Well, and as I think President Obama saw, it's very easy to campaign and demagogue on an issue saying you'd roll something back, like the Bush tax cuts, and then when you get into office, you can't actually do that. So, were Mitt Romney to win the presidency, would health care still be in place? Probably. And then the other part of this, too, is that the funding for that implementation, because that's an area where House Republicans have been able to choke some of that off. So it has made a difference in how this is being implemented and how much money they have to actually do the things that the law lays out.
Carl, I think one of the surprises about this presidency is how strong President Obama has been in terms of national security and going after terrorists and dismantling al-Qaeda. And that his weakness has been domestic policy. That's not the way it's supposed to work for a Democratic president. And I must say, I've been listening to Ron Suskind's book, The Contenders, on audio, and it reminds me of when I used to listen to all those books about how the Bush administration mishandled the reconstruction in Iraq, and the dysfunction that appears to have been in the White House and among the economic team and sort of the missed opportunities, have now left us with a very weak economy and a president who not really confident that he has a plan for the future. And I think the voters are ambivalent about whether he is up to the task.
Well, Eleanor, you and I are old enough to remember Democrats who were very strong on defense. So, he may hark to an earlier model in that. Yeah. But in terms of the economy, the president inherited a mess. He says that, but it's not really in dispute. And in the meltdown of the markets, the housing bubble, everything that happened really during in the last months of the campaign, 2008. It probably hurt McCain a little bit. I don't think he would have won anyway. But and people say it's the worst. It was the worst recession since the Depression. Well, they were saying that well before it was true, but it's true now. And we have two things going on in 2008 that we didn't have in 1932. First of all, we had a president who was talking to the president-elect. George W. Bush brought President-elect Obama into the process, told him what he was planning on doing, asked him if he agreed. He did. George Bush gets no credit for this, but I think he ought to. And the Obama people at first were suspicious of it. It's so apart from our experience. Roosevelt certainly didn't do it with Hoover. But in time, I think Obama was thinking, was he trying to saddle me with this already? I haven't even been to the inaugural ball yet. But actually, Bush wanted to do these bailouts. He wanted to make sure Obama was on board. He was. Then on January 23rd, 3 days after the inauguration, the Republican leaders, there was a bipartisan meeting in the White House, and I think it was in the Roosevelt Room. And Eric Cantor, who brought a piece of paper, actually. It was kind of cheeky. He was the junior person of the elected officials there, but he had the Republican approach to how to deal with this crisis. Most of those things, I know them, but I'd say all of them were tax cuts, essentially. It's good Republican dogma these days. And Obama looked at that list. Excuse me. They talked about it, and he said something like, and both sides agreed to this, well, elections have consequences. I trump you on that one. It was some point that John Kyle and Cantor were talking about with the president. Now, this has entered the lexicon of especially in right-wing talk radio, as an example of the president's intransigence and arrogance. It was not understood at that moment by the people who were there, including Mitch McConnell and John Boehner, who came out of the meeting. And you could go to YouTube and find it on C-SPAN. I was there, and there were the cameras there that we call it the stakeout, and these guys talked, and they thought they could do business with Obama, and they said so. In fact, what they talked about among themselves when they got back to the Capitol was what Obama said when he opened Cantor's piece of paper, which he said, well, I don't see anything too crazy in here, Eric, and they thought, well, we can do business with this guy. And it turned out they couldn't do business with him. And the reason was a misunderstanding on each side. These Republicans, it seems quaint now, Mitch Daniels and Cantor never have anything kind to say about this president. And in 2010, Mitch McConnell was told National Journal that he thought, in fact, I think he said it to Major Garrett, who's the moderator at the next panel, that the Republican priority had to be making sure that he was a one-term president. But that day they thought they could work with him. Why did they think they could work with him on the economy? They had this idea that he was a moderate, and they've told me this. Cantor's told me this. It sounds unlikely that they would believe this. Obama campaigned as a traditional liberal, and he is a traditional liberal, and both of the parties are polarized. There's not conservative Democrats anymore, there's liberal Republicans anymore. But what Obama did do in the campaign is he didn't speak about George W. Bush and Dick Cheney the way it had become common, even for Democrats who know better, to speak about him. Cheney was routinely derided as being evil. Bush was routinely derided as being stupid. Obama didn't talk this way, with very rare exceptions. He campaigned not as a moderate, but in moderate tones. He campaigned as a guy who seemed reasonable and accessible, who really believed the things he was saying about uniting the country. What they didn't know and should have known was that the Democrats and the president, they had, Rahm Emanuel was really liaison. They wanted this stimulus bill to be ready to go. They didn't want to spend months on it. The economy was losing 700,000 jobs a month. And so Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, had told her caucus she was going to have a bill ready. They wanted it ready when Obama got here. Now, they didn't quite make that, but they almost did. They passed it on January 27th. But by January 27th. But by that meeting on the 23rd, Nancy Pelosi had already given the writing of the stimulus bill to Dave Obey. And Obey is from Wisconsin. He's sort of, think if you don't know his politics, if you're younger, he's the un-Paul Ryan. He's the opposite in every way, generational, stylistically. Ryan's sweet, Obey's caustic, Obey's liberal, Ryan's conservative. He's a New Dealer. The other guys, I don't know what Ryan's economic theories would be. It's Ryanism. Anyway, so you had this bill, and I'll fast forward. It added about $900 billion to a federal deficit. Revenues declined to the Treasury. You had deficits now, annual deficits, unheard of numbers, $1 trillion every year. You know, when Michelle Bachmann says it's a generational theft, I mean, theft is not the right word, but it is a generational transfer of resources that's unprecedented. And how did they sell this? Larry, the president's economic team said that if this did not pass, unemployment could go to 8%. And this was a scare tactic. Some of us thought, oh, 8%. Well, it went to 8%, and then 9%, and then 10%. And it's been at 9% the entire time, basically, Obama's been president. And it is that's a number, and it doesn't sound, you know, as frightful as it really is. So let me just break it down for you, and then I'll stop. That's about 14 million Americans who are looking every day, 3 times a week anyway, for a job and can't find one. The Bureau of Labor, and that's really a phony number. The Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates that another 1 million, and I think it's closer to 3, Americans have simply stopped looking because they're demoralized. On top of that, you have people staying in school longer, you have retirees going back to work, you have a whole disrupted workforce, and then there's another term, the underemployed, that political writers, all of us have had to learn it, we didn't know it before. That's people working part-time who want to be working full-time, and that's another 7 to 10 million people. All in all, Barack Obama is president of a country where 1 out of 4 or 5 able-bodied Americans can't find full-time work with health care benefits and a salary. And that's a number that, and I don't presume to judge, you know, what he thinks about it, but I think everyone in the White House knows that re-election under these circumstances is going to be very difficult.
I think certainly assessing what went wrong on the economy is a tough subject, but I don't think it's all Nancy Pelosi and David Obey. And I suspect that Norm might have another view here. Norm wrote a book called The Broken Branch, which is about the Congress. And we're watching the super committee today struggle to try to come to terms with deficit reduction. And President Obama campaigned on his belief that he could bring people together and break the partisan lock that the two parties had on Capitol Hill. It didn't work out that way. So, Norm, what's your view of what went wrong here?
Thanks, Eleanor. First, I'm glad to be here on a pretty gray day. It's 61 and foggy, a little bit like Rick Perry. I would like to put your question into historical perspective, but we have a new standard. As a historian, I'd have to charge Larry $1.6 right, to $1.8 million to do so. Or at least $300,000 for just one appearance, apparently. But that aside,
checks in the mail.
That's right.
The post office.
That aside, let me just step back and give you a little bit of a sense, which would be a little bit different than Carl's. Mm-hmm. A lot of this played out in a fashion that has a template with 1993. Bill Clinton came in with a Congress that had robust majorities of Democrats, almost exactly the same numbers in the House and Senate as Barack Obama did. And the attitude of Republicans at the time, having now been shut out of power completely, 38 years out in the House, a number in the Senate, and after 12 years in the White House, and it was basically pretty overt. All right, you got the reins of power, you're on your own. Not a single vote for anything. And of course, that created enormous headaches for Clinton. The major reason being that he couldn't keep his own Democrats together. After 38 years in power in the House, it was presidents come and go. We're the power center here. We decide what will happen. So his signature bill which he tried to build with bipartisan consensus. Remember, he held a summit in Little Rock in the transition. First, he had a stimulus package, which we all thought was huge at the time. $16 billion. Oh, my God. Died on a filibuster in the Senate. And the economic package took almost 8 months to get through by one vote in each house, not a single Republican voting for it. And then we cascaded through the health care debacle and, of course, then a midterm election in which Newt Gingrich, who was a major architect of that strategy, reaped the rewards and became the Speaker. We went through a year of difficult confrontation and pretty much gridlock that culminated in the shutdown of the government, and then Newt changed his tune, believing that basically the Republicans would not have a second term in the majority unless there was bipartisan cooperation and policy, and he was willing, by and large, to throw Bob Dole under the bus to achieve that goal. And, of course, we got many things happening. This time, it was a little bit of a surprise that we would start in the same way. After all, Clinton got elected in a three-way race with 43.5% of the votes. The Democrats did not gain seats in Congress. He had negative coattails and no strong sense of momentum. And here you get Obama elected in one of the clearest mandate elections in terms of a landslide victory in popular and electoral vote terms, huge coattails, winning big seats in both houses after having won big in the previous midterm election, biggest economic catastrophe since the Great Depression, teetering at the abyss, 70% approval rating at the inauguration. And despite what Mitch McConnell and Eric Cantor said coming out of that meeting at the White House, which I do not believe reflected a genuine viewpoint, it was, I'm not going to come out of the White House 3 days after the inaugural with the economy looking like that and saying, for Mr. President, this is for you. I think there was a concerted strategy because we got the vote on the stimulus just a few days later. Now, I would remind you that that stimulus, 40% of it was tax cuts. And in fact, it was the third largest tax cut we have ever had. Many of those tax cuts put in by Republicans. For example, the biggest tax cut was an extension of the alternative minimum tax, put in at the suggestion of Chuck Grassley, who then, of course, voted against the whole thing. And not a single Republican in the House voted for it. Now, was this a spontaneous eruption of unhappiness because Dave Obey wrote the bill? Maybe in part, and certainly there were reasonable objections to Democrats shutting out Republicans. But if you watch the dynamic on the House floor that day, you had poor hapless Joseph Gao, the first Vietnamese American member of Congress elected by accident because the sacrificial lamb running against William Jefferson happened to be in the right place at the right time where people were fed up with Jefferson, the $90,000 in the freezer and all the rest of it. So here's a guy from a district that gave Barack Obama something like 74% of the votes. His one chance, the slim reed of winning re-election, is to be an independent, and the first bill that comes up, massive money for his Katrina-ravaged district. If you watched, on the floor, Joseph Gao was the bologna in a sandwich between Eric Cantor and John Boehner, who squeezed him until he popped and fell on the grenade. And they did a little victory jig so that they could get unanimity. They were making a very strong statement. Now, we moved to the Senate where there was a difference. You got 3 Republicans who basically held the stimulus hostage for a bunch of things that actually were not stimulative and took some of the stimulative elements out of it. But all that aside, it was clear we were on a path that was similar, with the big difference being that this time Democrats, having no longer the arrogance that comes from being in power for 38 years, and having a more homogeneous group, were able to provide enough votes to get it through fairly quickly. And we settled into a pattern which is now the norm in American politics, which is parliamentary parties in a non-parliamentary system. And those two things do not go together. But it's in particular a minority party acting as a pure parliamentary party and using a set of tactics that also were not present, another difference from the Gingrich years. We didn't have filibusters used on every routine matter. to try and stretch out the time, clog up the process, keep things from happening. We didn't have filibusters used on bills or nominations that ended up passing unanimously so that you could take up a week or two with not just the votes on cloture, the time necessary to get there, but then the 30 hours of debate after cloture, where nobody is on the floor debating but had taken up all that time. So it was a very different dynamic. Now, it's a dynamic that played out in another way very differently than the first two Clinton years, which had some things passed but were not terribly productive. This was an enormously productive Congress in terms of the outputs, the legislative outputs. If you simply look at whether you like them or don't like them, the breadth and depth of their impact on the public and the economy is at least as great, if not greater, than the Great Society 89th Congress. You could say it might even rival the New Deal. But every one of them was done in a win-ugly fashion on a partisan basis. And the outcome was the same as 1994. The public didn't like gridlock in 94. They massively voted against Democrats and brought Republicans into the majority. They didn't like the ugly victories and the way the process was playing out with nothing done in a way where people were coming together to seemingly to solve problems the way they think it ought to be done. And so we got the massive backlash again. And now where we are is with divided government in a parliamentary party dynamic, which cannot work. Now, just to give you put that together with another phenomenon, which is the permanent campaign. And take not one but three McConnell statements, which I think characterize our time. No, I know. I'm just saying. You mentioned the one. Let's add two more. You know, the one which he's repeated numerous times, of course, is my number one goal is to make Barack Obama a one-term president. The second was an interview he gave to The Atlantic after the midterm elections, in which he said, well, of course we didn't cooperate with the president, making it pretty clear, I think, that there was a conscious strategy here. Because if we had, those accomplishments would have been seen as bipartisan, and people would have liked him, he would have gotten credit for them. And we wanted to draw the lines here. So we were not going to see bipartisan cooperation, whatever was in the bills, for the reasons that have to do with the nature of the permanent campaign. And the third, also striking to me, was about 2 or 3 days before we finally got a deal at the 59th minute of the 11th hour on the debt limit this time. And that was Mitch saying, you know, if we breach the debt limit, it could bring economic chaos. And we'll get blamed for it, just like we did in '95. And it will, and I quote, damage the Republican brand. So we got to strike a deal. Now, that's very interesting because it tells you something about the mindset of politics now. This is not all one party, but right now it is the minority party. And it wasn't Mitch saying, you know, if we breach the debt limit, it could cause economic chaos, and we can't let that happen. It was, it'll damage the brand, and we can't let that happen. The implication was, if it brings economic chaos and he gets blamed, bring it on. And where we are now is a president who thought in his first 2 years that if you focus on accomplishments and getting things through Congress, the products will speak for themselves, which certainly was not the case, in significant part because of the economic travails that we're under, who believed in the first part of 2011 that since Americans have said we want you to work together to solve problems, if he just looked like he was the guy trying to make it work, and it didn't, that the independents would like that. Instead, they saw it as weakness. And now he's out there framing it in a different way and defining terms in a different fashion. And now it's interesting as we approach the 59th minute of the 11th hour, or at least we're close to the 11th hour on the supercommittee, to see the mindsets working and trying to develop political calculations where you're getting lines drawn in a different way. And so you had McConnell, here's a fourth statement, last week saying, I don't think President Obama wants a deal. He wants it to fail so that he can use it as another piece of evidence to blame the do-nothing Congress. And we've got each side trying to figure out what the calculus is. I had a prominent Republican say to me privately a while back, look, part of the strategy here is if things go really badly, they'll drag him right down. We'll suffer a flesh wound, you know, but we'll hold the House because the redistricting has given us enough protection. Maybe we lose 18, 20 seats. We're back to a 5-seat majority. and we only need 3 in the Senate if we win the White House, and we got 23 targets to only 10 of our own, and in an anti-incumbent year, we can probably do that. And then we got a situation just like George W. Bush in 2001. He got the tax cuts under reconciliation. We can get a lot of our agenda done. Now there's a lot of calibrating going on, where you have, saw crawl under one of the cable news shows yesterday, CBS News, New York Times poll, communism more popular than Congress. 11% for communism, 9% for Congress. There's a little bit of nervousness that this could backfire. And you have now, I think, a Republican leadership that doesn't want to throw a presidential candidate under the bus, but they don't want to lose their majorities either. So we don't know how that dynamic plays out. What we do know is 2 things. The first is, whatever happens here, it's not going to make Americans much happier, because the nature of the global economy following a financial crisis, no matter what policies you pursue, is going to be a grim one for a significant period of time. And second, there isn't very much that will happen in 2012 that's going to break this dynamic and change the parties away from trying to operate as parliamentary parties in a system that just won't sustain it.
Right. I must say, in the polling about Congress is more popular at 9% than Fidel Castro. I think he came in at 5%, so maybe that's somewhat hope. I must say,
but less than Hugo Chavez.
right. I must say, in my own reporting on the dynamics on the supercommittee, the notion that the president doesn't want a deal, I know that's kind of taken hold, which shows the power of the Republican messaging machine. But the way the White House looks at this, if they don't get a deal, all incumbents get hurt. But Obama is the biggest target, and that the Republicans are willing to take some wounds if they can get at the president. And I think that they are pretty confident they can hold the House no matter what. Now, Democrats think they need, 25 seats, and they show you the math and how the districts that are targeted are districts that Obama won, some Obama and Kerry won. But redistricting is a powerful tool, and the Republicans do control a lot of the state houses and the state legislatures. So it's a pretty cynical picture, though, looking at what's at stake here. If the committee doesn't come up with something or comes up with a deal too small that the markets sneer at it, it could invite a downgrading by the other 2 rating agencies, which would make money a lot more expensive to borrow and could really bring the economy further down. So it's a very serious issue that gets all involved in the shenanigans of the party politics. Anyway, Leslie, you're the last to speak here, and you definitely follow the increasingly important role of Hispanics in the electoral process. And this president won in part because he put together a coalition of Hispanics, African Americans, and young people. And there's a real question as to whether that coalition is going to be available to him in 2012. So tell us what you're seeing on the political landscape.
Sure. Thank you so much. And I heard there was a little bit talked about Latino vote in the last panel. I just want to say whether Republican or Democrat, hug a Latino, because that's pretty much going to be a big indicator in terms of support for either of our candidates on the left or the right. There's a very interesting conversation that is happening about Hispanic vote, Latino vote. What do we call it? I mean, I always say, we come from 23 different countries. We speak 3 different languages, English, Spanish, and Spanglish, if you ask my mother, which is a combination of 2 languages and half the grammar. But in all seriousness, there is a dynamic, and I very much think we talk about Latino vote in this country like it's the 1960s. Like we're still talking about ethnic solidarity, we're going to vote together in a block, and one day there's going to be this awakening of Latino vote. Read all the Sleeping Giants and all these things, and a lot of comparisons with the African American community. The thing with Latino is it's in a state of movement right now, and self-discovery in terms of who they are, and that deals with assimilation, geography, acculturation, language preference, ethnicity. There's so many different things that are going to help you define where Latino votes are going to be in 2012, but there's a couple things I want to point to. If you look at the fact, just straight numbers, Republicans have earned 30%, about 31% of the Hispanic vote for the last 10 presidential elections. Just take it all the way back. So that's where we start. You've seen high points of Bush, the second term, 44%. You've seen low points, Bob Dole, that was embarrassing. We try not to think about that. We had Pete Wilson in those years, and you can see it on the state levels, too. You've seen a lot of Republicans do increasingly well. What the distinct difference is if you're starting at, Republicans are at 30, Democrats are at a very hard Kennedy blue 45%. There's not a lot of movement in there. So we're talking about another group, a pocket of voters that move back and forth, this rise of an independent Latino voter. You saw 67% of support for Barack Obama in 2008. He picked up a lot of those swing voters voting on economic issues. It was not on immigration. It was not on, what it possibly could be, or a Hispanic Supreme Court justice. It was really this issue of the benefit of the doubt to the Democratic Party on the economy. And if you look at that issue, that's pretty much consistent with non-Hispanic voters. That's what's interesting about Latino. On economic issues, they were voting with pretty much everybody else and how they looked at the big picture. Now, by every indication, most national polls, the president is at about 50% on two key factors I want to point to. Generic ballot, he's 48% Obama, 35% Republican. There's a split on whether he deserves re-election. 47% say he does, 47% say it's time for someone else. What's interesting about that is the drop in support that Obama had between 2008 and right now is not Republican. They were never going to support him anyway. It's conservative Democrats or Democrats who feel disappointed in the president not meeting in these broken promises. Then my friends on the left will say, oh, it's because of immigration. The president's pushing on immigration reform. He'll go to the National Council of La Raza. He'll go to any Hispanic audience that will listen and say that the Republicans stopped immigration reform and this whole ridiculous nonsense that anybody's been in this debate, which I think a lot of us have for many years and I for 16, know that you can't just say you're going to have immigration reform in 10 minutes, use the last bit of political capital you have at the end of it, right before an election year, and expect it to happen. There were 22 hearings held on immigration reform leading to 2007. And there were none leading, past the president's call for some sort of comprehensive reform, an amnesty or path to citizenship or anything like that. So we knew there was a lot of kind of window dressing on the right and the left. I do say Republicans take responsibility for that too. But the more interesting thing is that deportations have gone up to 1.2 million. It's twice where George W. Bush was at the same point in his presidency. That is the part that is really dividing the Latino voting group, is a community that fundamentally believes in family and bringing people together has a very hard time looking at an administration that is splitting families and deporting them back. That's what it's coming down to.
Aren't the deportations mostly people who have records and various things? They've tried to be selective about who they're sending back.
There is discrepancy on that, and that was the pushback. That was the rejoinder. Oh, it's only people with criminal records, maybe some DUIs in there, just a lot of drunken driving, those type of things. But what it did do that you didn't see before is a higher increase or uptick in splitting of those families that we didn't hear before. And if he's on track, according to some statistics, and I'd have to verify it, you haven't seen a deportation this high since Eisenhower.
And yet the Republican Party says he's soft on immigration.
Exactly.
And the Republican Party in the debates also, some of the rhetoric there has been pretty harsh, and some, alleged jokes about electrifying fences and that sort of thing. How does that play into the
It is
Hispanic vote.
extraordinarily damaging. So if on one side you have a community that feels like there's broken promises and it's just a lot of fluff on the left, and on the right you hear from certain candidates who are talking about electrifying the fence, send them all back, banana republic. We can go back to the number of things that we've heard. In an interesting case scenario, the Spanish media didn't help with that. If you listen back during the last election cycle, the two most common names were Sensenbrenner and Tancredo, who, as far as I know, were not exactly national candidates for presidency, but it didn't really matter. The image that Republicans, some type of Republican, was anti-Hispanic or anti-Latino or anti-Mexican, sticks in the consciousness of many of these voters, or soon-to-be voters. It has a long-term effect. Just to give you an example of how people's memories of the story of how Latino is thinking of themselves in this country, and I'll end on that point. We do focus groups across the country, Spanish, English voters, new voters, and one of the, I was in Southfield, I believe Southfield, Michigan. It's right outside Detroit. Talking to Spanish bicultural women, his voters, about the election, different things, and we said, what do you think of Republicans, what do you think of Democrats? They start, telling you these different things and these one-word answers, and they said, oh, it's like Bush. He said the little brown ones. That was 30 years ago, over 30 years ago, and they were talking about former President Bush making a comment about Jeb Bush's family, about George P. Yeah, his grandkids.
He said it lovingly.
He said it lovingly, but that term came up in numerous focus groups from California to Michigan to different things among women of a certain age, and it was consistent in that people had a memory. There's a flashpoint of things. There will be a flashpoint of these marches that you saw from 2006, 2007. There will be flashpoints of electrifying the fence. In this kind of media environment, Republicans are not doing themselves any favors because they do have significant long-lasting effects, and to that end, there's certainly opportunities for the Democrats, but I think there's a lot of challenges on both sides.
Okay, I think some of the panelists want to say something. Christina, and I want to encourage that as well.
Yeah, from a political perspective, I'd say that's exactly what the Obama team is counting on. They say multiple times, first, that they're looking at growth among Latino voters, and an enormous amount of new people that are getting registered, even a major increase since 2008. And that's where you're seeing, in the battle for the House control, too, you're seeing new seats in places like Texas and Florida because there's been so much population growth among Latino voters especially. But they really, when you talk to them about this, they say if you watch any of those debates, you watch the boos that Rick Perry got when he talked about his State Dream Act, this is exactly what we can campaign on because, yeah, we may not have fulfilled your promises, but we're going to do better than those guys. And I think that will make for a very ugly election.
I do. Just one thing. Very much to that point, you looked at the Electoral College, 4 states. When you talk about Colorado, Florida, New Mexico, Nevada, they were 46 electoral votes 2008. They're going to be 49 votes this time. You can have more redistricting. Some of the candidates that have won on the Republican side, though, have been Tea Party candidates. I'd argue that. And if it does turn out to be somebody like Romney, he had a Hispanic coalition. He met with Hispanic small business owners. He didn't have that caustic kind of anti-legal immigrant tone. And if anything, there's a couple times when he's trying to calm down the tone of the debate.
Yeah, I would, a couple of things. First, whenever you hit difficult economic times, populism emerges, and it emerges across the spectrum. And there's some parts that the left, right, and center have in common there. Go back to '92 with Ralph Nader and Pat Buchanan and Ross Perot. Here we see at least a little bit of a divergence. The populism on the left now is the 99% and the 1%. It's very much in economic terms. The populism on the right is both anti-establishment, including anti-establishment within their own party, and one of Romney's challenges is if he doesn't put this away early, you're going to get what remains of a Republican establishment trying to close ranks around him, and a lot of Tea Party types are going to be very resentful of that. And that, of course, is not just immediate populism. That goes back to Robert Taft against the establishment of Tom Dewey and Wendell Willkie, to the reaction of the Goldwater people and on. But it's also much more strongly anti-immigrant now in a way that's almost religious. And if you look at how Perry's balloon got deflated long before he made his mistakes and gaffes on that one issue, But look at how Romney then tried to get to his right on immigration and criticize him for what he had done. It's a perilous path for Romney. It also suggests that, when Romney had Chris Christie standing up there and making a stronger case for Romney than Romney made for himself, and he just looked ecstatic. Look at what Christie has said in the past on immigration. You bring him forward as a vice presidential candidate, and it'll take 2 minutes before, well, that's a big balloon to deflate. It might take a long time for the helium to come out. But that simply is a non-starter. And I think a dilemma that any Republican nominee is going to have now is, how can you walk through this minefield, trying not to alienate Latino voters enough that any of the qualms they have about Obama will be overcome, and yet not create this firestorm, because this is a litmus test now for an awful lot of angry people out there.
You introduced the name Romney. I just want to do a quick lineup here. Does everybody assume Romney is going to be the Republican nominee, and is he the strongest contender against Obama? Let me just do a quick. You want to start, Leslie?
Sure, I'm happy to start.
Okay.
Kind of the conventional wisdom in all things moving is that he will likely be the last man standing. Just a
Okay.
different type of endorsement, but.
Norm, yeah.
Well, his strategy is to be the last man standing, and the strategy of Newt and all the others is to be the last anti-Romney candidate standing. But with a guy who's won every debate, which is really unusual, and you got 8 or 9 candidates up there, who's put together the best organization, has the best professionals, has done this before, has the money and all of that he can't crack 25% in any of the surveys, suggests that this may be a more complicated path to a nomination. I say it's 70% that it's Romney, but I could also envision even a scenario where you go right to the convention, and some of the establishment may turn and decide they'd be better off watching a Jeb Bush or a Mitch Daniels emerge at that stage.
Oh, a brokered convention?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Well, I don't, every 4 years,
I know.
reporters, and we get together and we go in the bar at the Sheraton Wayfair in New Hampshire and say, wouldn't it be fun to have a brokered convention? Norm wants to cover one, but we're never going to see another one. So I don't know if it will be Romney, but I believe that he's the only person they have who could beat Obama. I don't say he will. I think he's the only one they have who could.
Okay. Christina?
Before I left D.C. for this semester at Harvard, Stu Rothenberg, who runs the Rothenberg Political Report, and I took a piece of paper and we wrote down our chances. And he wrote 50% Perry, 50% Romney. This was August 15th or so. And I wrote 30% Romney, 30% Perry, 30% John Huntsman. And I really actually still believe that. And a lot of people laugh at me, but I just feel like this is an electorate that, exactly the reasons these fine folks laid out. Romney remains having a really hard time getting those conservatives. I've spent a lot of time in New Hampshire because it's so close to Cambridge, and, Ron Paul really does have something special there. He's getting more turnout at any of his events than anything else. Do I think he'll be the Republican nominee? No, but I think he really puts a chink in Mitt Romney's math. So I still think it's a third.
So you think could Huntsman pull off a win in New Hampshire?
Anything is possible. I will not say Romney will be the nominee.
Okay.
I don't have a lot to add on this. I think what Carl said so it covers it.
Okay, all right. I think we have a little under 10 minutes left, so I want to invite the audience to ask questions. And, all right, we have 2 in the back, on the far right, and then the fellow next to him.
This is primarily for Norm. Norm,
You're going to have to repeat the questions.
why
Okay.
do you think that President Obama didn't, after the election was conducted, didn't embrace Simpson Bowles more directly? And how do you think that would change the equation if we use that as a framework for the budget deficit, jobs, and vacancies?
Yeah, I want to repeat the question. He's wondering why President Obama didn't embrace the Simpson-Bowles Commission, and if he had, if that would have made a difference in where we are today.
I must say, I was flabbergasted watching the State of the Union message after the 2010 elections and wondering why what seemed so obvious a path was not taken by Obama, and I still don't have an answer. I mean, to stand up at your State of the Union message and say, I created this commission, and just like the rest of you, I may not agree with every bit of what they've done, but I'm demanding that you in the Congress take it as a template and come up with a path to get us off this debt cycle. It would have changed the entire dynamic. And the only explanation that I have is, which I think is part of a reflection of the mistakes for the first 2.5 or close to 3 years, is that there was a conscious decision not to use the bully pulpit to shape a narrative, but to maneuver through a political process in a different way. And I think it was a big mistake, and a much greater mistake after the 2010 elections. And if you're looking for mistakes the administration made, that one would be right at the top of the list for me.
Right, I agree.
Can I add something to that? The commission, even before they came back with their report, Norm, you'll remember this, we talked about it. There was the idea was to whether they should make it the binding. In other words, to build into the thing like you did. You remember the base closings? The base closing commission. Build into it that you'll get a vote. You build right into the enabling legislation of the commission that you'll get an up or down vote on it, and that you'll have to vote on the whole thing. It doesn't bind members of Congress to approving it, but they have to vote it up or down. And the White House resisted that. That's the part where I think by then they'd already taken the steam out of the thing. They walked away from it before it really got going, and they never, it seemed for reasons that aren't clear to me, they never re-embraced it. But I wanted to add one thing, because while Norm was speaking earlier, I had said that it's be very hard for a president to win re-election when unemployment was the way it is. But there's one thing going on the other side, and Norm, when he was talking about Mitch McConnell, reminded me of it. The Democrats, the president himself is starting to fool around with this idea, to almost say it directly, that the Republican leadership in Congress are resisting legislation that they think will help the economy for partisan purposes. Now, that is a very perilous thing to say, because you're essentially accusing the people of being unpatriotic. But it's also a perilous thing for Republicans if that sense takes root. And I think there is a chance that sense will take root. And so this economy, voters out there are thinking the Great Recession is less like a cyclical downturn and more like a disruptive historic economic restructuring, and they're scared. And when they see Congress, if they decide that Congress or the president are playing partisan games, they're going to be angry. They're going to have a right to be angry. Who's hurt is who they decide is the most cynical.
Right, right.
Let me add it. Actually, in some ways, he has to do that. He's going to do that, and he has to do that because the Republicans, we always talk about this term like values voters. In reality, everyone is a values voter, and we're getting to the point where one party believes that, I guess Newt Gingrich said, Obama's kind of a godless, Saul Alinsky liberal. I mean, I think if you watch that Jon Stewart rally last year, was a good example. The Democratic Party has become one that believes the Republicans are intransient, kind of unintellectual, unthoughtful, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the view. If you listen to his speeches, he's moved very far. Carl talked about Obama sort of respected Republicans and spoke about them in a very centrist and sort of a very patient way about it. I just happen to disagree with him. He's moving toward a zone where he thinks they are, I don't want to say bad people, but he's definitely moving toward, much more cultural argument about here's our party and here's why it's different. And he has to do that because the voters, he's lost a lot of independence, and he needs to make sure that every person who watches Jon Stewart, that all those kinds of liberals come out in big numbers this time.
I said yes to this gentleman over here, and then we'll get some others over there. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to hear from the panel regarding the situation with young people in 2012, because right now the Occupy movement is getting a lot of steam and it's taking over the narrative from the Tea Party and everything. But the invasion, I guess, by Bloomberg this week, got an interesting dynamic that the question is, did Obama know it was going to happen? And I think a lot of people are going to be questioning that. So I think the base, the Democratic Party, might be debating how much to, and young people especially, how much to support the president. And is the White House in their messaging and OFA and organizing going to try to reflect the Occupy movement, or are they going to play the facts?
Okay, this is a question about the Occupy Wall Street movement and how it plays in. The White House seems to me kind of embracing it, but not fully. Christina, you want to take that?
Yeah, for the last 3 months, I've spent all of my hours with 19 and 20-year-olds, so I feel like I do have a little bit of authority to speak on this at this point. There's also an Occupy Harvard movement where there's a bunch of tents in the yard right now that is, irritating everybody. But I think President Obama is going to still have youth strongly. All of the obviously Harvard's a more liberal campus, so most of the people that I'm interacting with are strong Obama supporters. But I've talked to them specifically about whether they've sort of lost their support, if they're as enthusiastic as they were 4 years ago. And what a lot of them have sort of suggested to me is that the people that are in the 24 to 28 range, they're the ones that he has to worry about. The college student, people that are sympathizing with the Occupy movements, they actually are still with him because they thought it was so cool to like him in 2008, and they've actually, didn't get to vote for him. Now that they're of voting age, they want to be involved. They're very involved in learning about, Senate campaigns and where they can help. They know a lot about the electoral math. As far as the Occupy movement and whether Barack Obama knew that Bloomberg was going to give him the boot out of, New York City, I don't know that, but I do know that the Republicans have done a very good job of trying to tie liberal Democrats to the movement and portray the movement as, dirty hippies, drug addicts, criminals, violent, all those things. And I think that that's what you're going to see in attack ads in the coming year. You're going to see a lot of any Democratic sympathetic comments that came out are going to be tied to those images, and it's going to be a mess.
Okay. Well, I see I see 4 hands up. Why don't you each say your question, and then we'll answer them selectively. Okay, go ahead.
Considering all the changes that have taken place in 2008, I was wondering whether you think that the Obama campaign in 2012 will be able to successfully implement such a far-reaching grassroots fundraising movement as they did in 2008.
Okay, grassroots fundraising. Over here.
Assuming no change in the Senate or the House, will President Romney have a better chance of affecting the grand bargain? And should that be relevant?
Okay, President Romney and the grand bargain. And yes?
How much effect will
Citizens United. Okay, and yes.
And considering that foreign policy and national security were once thought to be Obama's weakness when he ran for the first presidential bid, how do you assess his current, the administration's policy on foreign policy, and kind of looking ahead, how the administration is able to deal with kind of the IAEA nuclear reports or the uprisings in the Middle East or any other?
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, the first one about grassroots fundraising, that kind of ties in also with Citizens United, sort of the flood of money out there and who gets what share. Who's the expert on that? Norm, that your thing?
Well, it cuts a little close to the bone because I had some role in what the Supreme Court eviscerated. First, Obama's still got a massive and impressive fundraising operation. And, I keep reading the stories. It's reporters trying to force the square peg into the round hole. The funding from the people who gave in 2008 isn't there now. Meantime, he's racking up huge numbers from people who never gave before, including small donors and the larger ones. Some of the really big megabucks Democratic donors from the past are not going to pour in the huge money. And in that sense, the Citizens United impact, which I believe will be long-lasting, far-reaching, and deeply destructive, is going to give more traction to Republicans. Karl Rove and Norm Coleman in their organizations, the American Action Fund for the latter and the American Crossroads and Crossroads GPS for the former, are going to pull in a lot of money from people, and a lot of it will come in through the 501c4s, so we won't know exactly who's giving it, and already they're pouring tons into ads. One of the impacts here, by the way, is going to be that candidates are increasingly going to have trouble getting their own messages across. You know, candidates for Congress have, under the law, the ability to get advertising at the lowest unit rate. That means you can get the same rate as their better advertisers for preemptible time. Now, if you're a car dealer and you want a spot on Glee or Modern Family, and somebody else comes in and pays full retail, you get bumped for 2 weeks, it's no big deal. If you're a candidate and somebody comes in and pays retail and you get bumped from October 21st to November 15th, it doesn't help you very much. What's happening with these outside groups is they're coming in and saying to the TV stations, I'll give you 25% premium over retail, and they're going to roadblock the prime spots, which the ones you want to hit. So that's a problem. Not to mention the fact that the corruption going on here, and it's true for everybody, it's shaking down individuals to get money. It's the corruption going in that direction, and then it's donors demanding things in return is huge. But fundraising for Obama will not be a problem. Fundraising, which otherwise might be a problem for the Republican candidate, as it is usually for a challenger, and it would be even more so now where you have an incumbent who doesn't have a primary challenge so he can stockpile money. It all gets washed out because of the outside groups. Funding will not be the issue in a presidential campaign.
Okay, and Carl, President Romney, would he be more successful in finding that elusive grand bargain?
Well, the factor that presidents rely on and hope for and pray for is luck. And what Romney really hopes will happen is this recession will end as he takes office, and the receipts will start coming back to the Treasury. In all seriousness, though, and President Norm spoke about Bill Clinton's budget deal that took about 8 months to pass. I think he signed it in August. He did two things that year that I thought were extraordinary. The first was he got that budget through on a straight party line vote. And what it did was so modest by, if you think about it, it brought the top rate almost to 40% of the income tax. It extended the earned income tax credit, something George W. Bush did too, to help the working poor join the middle class, and it cut the rate of growth of some federal programs, not many. It didn't really cut spending. And yet the markets responded very favorably to it because the markets saw Washington as being responsible. Bill Clinton will tell you, and he did in '96, that, well, half of Washington was responsible. He and his party were responsible. But that's what happened. In other words, it wouldn't take much for a president in this environment, you'd think, to tinker with the tax code to send a message to the markets. The problem is now the markets themselves. These Occupy Wall Street people have hit on a nerve, and Christina is talking about the Republican reaction to it. I'm not sure that's going to be the last word on it. There's a thought taking hold among independent voters that capitalism is a rigged game, and these people are onto that. And I think that what Romney's real challenge would be if he were the next president, I think it would be Obama's, is to restore faith in capitalism itself. I don't think that's an exaggeration. The budget's just part of it, the federal budget.
Okay, sure, and then you get to answer the last question, too.
Okay. On the foreign policy, is that what you wanted to ask
That's
about?
the foreign policy.
I mean, in terms of the policies, we could discuss another time. In terms of the election, the only reason foreign policy will matter, in my mind, is if a Herman Cain or a Rick Perry or someone who appears not to be able to answer a question coherently is the nominee. That'll be a big issue. I think that, the fact that bin Laden's been captured, unfortunately for President Obama, has not made a lot of difference in his support ratings. And if it's a Mitt Romney, someone who can discuss foreign policy pretty coherently, I think the election will still be about the economy. To add on the grand bargain point, I just wanted to say one thing. I think Mitt Romney, the grand bargain involves tax increases as far as I know, which I think Mitt Romney is committed to not doing. So I think that is an issue. You have to watch. Mitt Romney will have to worry about the Tea Party if he's president. I'm not sure he can sign a grand bargain the way it's been structured up to now. And the final thing, to talk about what Norm talked about, I think this election is going to show that campaign advertising, we talk about how much money in politics matters. I don't think people watch campaign ads the way they used to in the same way they used to. I think the ad of the Herman Cain guys, his ad who was smoking, the guy who was smoking was seen by many more people than the commercials Rick Perry's been paying thousands of dollars for. I think it's going to be a campaign where the viral video and the viral moment is much more important than the I'm Rick Perry and I approve this message. And I think that's where we're headed, is where the viral moment means much more than the campaign ad.
Okay. Thank you very much, panelists. I've been furiously taking notes. I learned a lot. Thank you. Thank you, audience.